Imagine you find a book. It's filled with hundreds of symbols you've never seen before. No dictionary exists for it. No living person has ever spoken the language inside it. The people who wrote it have been dead for 1,000 years, and yet somehow, someone figured out what it said. This happened not once, not twice, but over and over throughout history. And every time it happened, it changed everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. This is the story of how we cracked three of the most mysterious codes in human history. And the answer is stranger than you think. Chapter 1. The Stone That Broke Egypt Open. For 14 centuries, nobody could read Egyptian hieroglyphics. That sentence deserves a moment. 14 centuries. The entire history of Islam. The entire history of the European Middle Ages and Renaissance. The entire rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. All of that time. And nobody could read what the ancient Egyptians had written on their own walls, their own tombs, their own monuments. People tried. Greek scholars tried. Arab scholars tried. European scholars in the 1600s tried. A German Jesuit named Athanasius Kircher spent decades on it in the 1600s and produced elaborate and almost entirely wrong translations that were accepted as fact for over a century. The problem was the assumption. Everyone assumed that hieroglyphics worked like a symbolic language, that each picture meant a concept, a word, an idea. A bird meant soul. A sun meant God. An eye meant sight. It was a reasonable assumption. It was completely wrong. The breakthrough didn't come from a genius sitting alone with a manuscript. It came from an army. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. His soldiers were digging fortifications near a town called Rosetta when one of them struck something with a shovel. A large flat stone. Dark basalt. Covered in writing. 3 scripts. The same text written 3 times. In hieroglyphics at the top, in a later Egyptian script called Demotic in the middle, and in ancient Greek at the bottom. Ancient Greek scholars could read, which meant that for the first time in 14 centuries there was a key, but it still took 23 more years to fully crack it. The man who did it was a Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion. He had been obsessed with Egypt since he was 11 years old. He had learned Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, Chaldean, Sanskrit, Zend, Pahlavi, Parsi, and Coptic. An ancient Egyptian language still used in Christian church services, all before he was a teenager. That last one was the key nobody else had thought to use. Champollion realized something that everyone before him had missed. Hieroglyphics were not purely symbolic. They were partly phonetic. Some symbols represented sounds, not ideas. And when he compared the Greek text on the Rosetta Stone to the hieroglyphic text and looked for the name of a pharaoh, Ptolemy, he found a group of symbols enclosed in an oval loop, a cartouche that appeared exactly where the name appeared in Greek. He matched the sounds. P, T, O, L, M, Y, S. On September 14, 1822, Champollion walked into his brother's office in Paris, dropped a stack of papers on the desk, said, "I've got it," and collapsed on the floor unconscious from exhaustion. He had just unlocked 14 centuries of silence. Every inscription in every Egyptian temple, every scroll in every tomb, every wall in every pyramid, suddenly readable. A civilization that had been mute for over 1,000 years began to speak again. Chapter 2. The Amateur Who Cracked Bronze Age Greece. If Champollion's story is about obsession, the story of Linear B is about something stranger. It's about an amateur. Linear B is a writing system found on clay tablets, excavated from the ruins of ancient Mycenaean palaces in Greece and Crete. The tablets were baked hard when the palaces burned, ironically preserved by the same fires that destroyed everything else. The earliest ones were found in 1900 by a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans on the island of Crete. Evans found 2 related scripts, which he called Linear A and Linear B. He spent the rest of his long life working on them and never cracked either one. He died in 1941, aged 90, with the tablets still unread. For 50 years, the world's top classical scholars worked on Linear B and got nowhere. The prevailing theory was that it represented an entirely unknown language, possibly the language of the Minoans, a pre-Greek civilization that had left no other trace of its tongue. The man who solved it was not a professional scholar, he was an architect. Michael Ventris was born in 1922. He first saw Linear B tablets in a museum exhibition when he was 14 years old and became quietly fixated on them. He trained as an architect, fought in the Second World War, built a career designing buildings, and in his spare time for over a decade, he worked on the tablets. His method was statistical. He mapped which symbols appeared most frequently, which appeared at the beginnings of words, which at the ends, which clustered together. He built a grid, a mathematical framework of possible sound values, and kept refining it. In 1952, Ventris made an assumption he didn't expect to be true, just as a test. What if linear B represented an early form of Greek? It was considered almost absurd. The Mycenaean civilization predated classical Greece by centuries. Nobody expected them to have written in anything resembling Greek. But when Ventris plugged in Greek sound values, the tablets began to make sense. Not poetic sense, not mythological sense, mundane, bureaucratic, extraordinarily human sense. The tablets were inventories, lists, records of sheep and goats and jars of olive oil and rations of grain, and the names of workers and the amounts they were owed. The Bronze Age Greeks had not been writing literature or hymns or histories on these tablets. They had been doing accounting. Michael Ventris announced his decipherment in a BBC radio broadcast on July 1st, 1952. He was 29 years old. 4 years later, he was dead, killed in a car accident at 34 before he could fully see the impact of what he had done. Linear B turned out to be the oldest written form of Greek ever found, pushing the history of the Greek language back 500 years. An entire layer of civilization, previously invisible, suddenly had a voice. Chapter 3. The code that took until last century. If you think cracking Egyptian hieroglyphics in the 1820s was late, consider this. The Mayan writing system was not fully deciphered until the 1990s. Not the ancient past. The 1990s. While the internet was being invented. While people were watching Jurassic Park in cinemas. While the world was already modern, an entire ancient writing system was still locked. The Maya had one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world. Their cities rivaled anything in Europe or Asia. Their mathematics was extraordinarily advanced. They independently invented the concept of zero. Their astronomy was so precise that their calendar was more accurate than the one Europeans were using at the same time. And they wrote extensively on stone monuments, on the walls of temples, on bark paper books. But when Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, a bishop named Diego de Landa did something catastrophic. In 1562, he ordered the burning of every Mayan book he could find, thousands of them, calling them works of the devil. Only 4 Mayan books survived. Landa also, ironically, wrote down what he thought was a Mayan alphabet, matching Mayan symbols to Spanish letters. But his alphabet was wrong. Not because he was lying, but because he had made the same mistake everyone later made with hieroglyphics. He assumed the system was alphabetic, one symbol per sound. Mayan glyphs didn't work that way. For 4 centuries, scholars tried Landa's alphabet and got nowhere. The glyphs stayed silent. The first real crack came from an unexpected direction. A young Russian linguist named Yuri Knorosov was working in Leningrad in the early 1950s. Behind the Iron Curtain, with no access to the actual Mayan ruins, working only from photographs of the 4 surviving books. He proposed that Mayan writing was not alphabetic but syllabic, that each symbol represented a syllable, not a single sound or a whole word, and that multiple symbols could be combined to spell out words phonetically. Western scholars dismissed him for decades, partly because his work seemed too radical, partly because he was Soviet and the Cold War made academic exchange complicated. But Knorosov was right. The full decipherment came slowly through the work of dozens of scholars across several decades. A pivotal moment came in 1973 when a group of researchers met at a conference in Palenque, Mexico, and began sharing and cross-referencing their work systematically for the first time. An art historian named Linda Scheele, who had never studied archaeology before attending that conference, became one of the central figures in the final push, working alongside epigraphers, archaeologists, and crucially modern Maya people whose oral traditions held clues that purely academic approaches had missed. By the 1990s, the system was cracked, and what it revealed was staggering. The Maya had written detailed histories, dynastic records, accounts of wars and conquests and political alliances, astronomical observations, mythological texts. They had described their own civilization in their own words, and for 400 years those words had been locked behind symbols nobody could read. The pattern behind all three. Here is what these three stories have in common and why they matter. In every case, the people who failed were the experts who brought the wrong assumption to the problem. They assumed symbolic when the system was phonetic. They assumed unknown when the language was Greek. They assumed alphabetic when the system was syllabic. And in every case, the person who cracked it was someone who was willing to question the assumption everyone else had agreed on. Champollion questioned the idea that hieroglyphics were purely symbolic. Ventris questioned the idea that Mycenaean writing couldn't be Greek. Norosov questioned the idea that Landa's alphabet was correct. There is something else. All three of these decipherments revealed the same thing about ancient people. Not mythology, not religion, not the grand statement civilizations make about themselves. The first things we could read, in Egyptian, in Mycenaean Greek, in Mayan, were lists, accounts, the names of workers, the quantities of grain, the records of ordinary life. The ancient world, when it finally spoke, did not speak in poetry. It spoke in the language that every civilization, in every era, ultimately relies on. It counted things. And the fact that we can now read those counts, that we can trace a jar of olive oil recorded on a clay tablet in Bronze Age Greece, or a grain ration distributed in a Mayan city, or the name of a pharaoh carved into a tomb wall, means that the people who wrote them are no longer lost. They just needed someone willing to listen hard enough. If you don't want to miss it, hit subscribe.